In the background of this video, you see a man proposing to his bride-to-be at the beach. I believe it's around sunset, and he's smiling. And normally the question would be, would you marry me? And the woman would say, yes, I love to. But in this image, the man is saying, will you destroy my life? And she says, oh my God, yes. Why did I choose this picture? I chose this picture because this picture over here shows the common attitude of people when it comes to evil spirits. Because remember, it's either the Holy Spirit, who is God himself, or you are under the trap of evil spirits. It's one of the two. And most people, that means most human beings out there, they offer their safety on a silver platter to evil spirits. And the evil spirits are so excited they accept the invitation. Now, what am I talking about? The title of this message is why, well, I'm saying the message is about why mental health and sexuality are taboo subjects. I want you to think about something. If you go to a tennis match, what do you expect to see? Two tennis players. You expect to see the materials, that means the tennis field, and you expect to see tennis balls. What if you arrive at a tennis match but there are no tennis balls? You would think, what? How can you have a tennis match without tennis balls? Or another example. Let's say you go to an aquarium or an aquaria, somewhere where it's like a zoo where they have fish like whales or sea turtles. You're at this zoo for sea animals, but you're never allowed to discuss the quality of the water the animals live in. Anyone out there would think, this is a zoo where they house sea life, but you're not allowed to discuss the quality of the water that the sea animals or the sea life operates in? But isn't that the purpose, that you keep some sea life here for the public? Therefore, you need to maintain the quality of the water they reside in. They're sea creatures, right? So they need to operate in water. So the water must be in a good state. If the water is not in a good state, they will die or they'll become sick. So how can you have a zoo that houses sea life, but you're not allowed to discuss the quality of the water the sea life operates in? That will not happen in real life. Because you'll have inspection on you, you'll have the government after you, and you'll have to close down. Or let's say you go to a restaurant, and later you find out that the restaurant received a bad mark because they have no hygiene in the kitchen. Would you return to that restaurant? Of course not. Because if their hygiene in the kitchen is non-existent, that means your safety as a customer is also non-existent. But what if a restaurant owner tells you that it's none of people's business whether their kitchen is clean or not? Would you still trust going to that restaurant or that cafe? No, you wouldn't. You wouldn't do it. Yet, human beings in general, unfortunately also believers, that means human beings that are reborn, they tend to get along with this thing called society without questioning its core restrictions. Because society is one web of restrictions that are enforced through violence. That is what society is. It's a web of restrictions enforced through violence. That is what society is. So it's a fear construct. So there comes a point while growing up, I don't know where it happens in your teenage years or in your early 20s, there comes a point that you realize that something is amiss and that you need to ask the core questions. But don't you know that most people avoid asking the core questions? Look, if people tell you, don't walk on the left side of the road, because in the country there's an arrangement you drive and walk on the right side. Okay, you think, whatever, we don't want to have accidents on the road, so that's good. If they tell you not to run in a supermarket, you think, of course, don't run in a supermarket. People can bump into one another, people can get hurt, and of course you understand it. You understand that restriction also. That you're not allowed to take photographs at a military institution or at an hospital, people may say, okay, they can understand it. There are some restrictions that are practical, realistic, and necessary. But there are also restrictions that don't add up and that shouldn't exist. And the thing with such toxic restrictions is the moment you question why those restrictions exist, you get violence as a reaction. The moment you question a toxic restriction, you're faced with violence. So understand the following. Anytime there is a toxic restriction, because a taboo is a toxic restriction, anytime there is a taboo on anything, ask yourself what people are hiding. Okay, let's say now that you have this neighbor of yours and he's always complaining that children in the neighborhood are loud, that he can't stand them. He always has something to complain about people in the neighborhood. And he's very difficult when people are taking pictures outside. Now, in the public area, you're allowed to take pictures. Even journalists are allowed to do it. But he's very private. He doesn't want people to take pictures of his house. He one time even assaulted someone who was taking pictures outside of the neighborhood. He was there on an assignment by the municipality to take pictures. But the neighbor was not aware that he was sent by the municipality. He just assaulted the guy, saying he doesn't want pictures of his house. And the police came to him, arrested him. He had to spend 2 nights in jail. And he was left off with a warning that he should cut it out. So this man always has something to complain about the neighborhood, and he doesn't want people to take pictures near his home. It's later that someone began to ask, why is this guy so upset with people noticing his place of residence? It's then that the police conducted an undercover investigation, and they found out that this man was involved in human trafficking, in kidnapping children for satanic cults. It's then that everyone in the neighborhood realized that him complaining about other people all the time and him not wanting people to take pictures of his house was because he had something to hide. And it was something quite dirty that he had to hide. So we could never explain why he was so upset with people in the neighborhood. Neither could explain why he didn't want people to take pictures near his house, not even of the street where he lives. While he has nothing to say about that, why didn't he want that? Because he had something to hide. Or let's say you have a scam artist who tells you that once you transfer the fees, you'll get a loan, or you get whatever. You sign the contract, or maybe it's a real estate scam. You are about to rent a place and you now ask for the documentation. In a sense that you want the real estate officer to show you his license, he's allowed to practice his profession. And now the real estate officer, instead of just showing you his license, he begins to make excuses, or he begins to talk about something else. He distracts you with another subject. What do? You get out of there. Because if he is a real estate officer and he has nothing to hide and it's not a scam, it wouldn't be any difficult. He wouldn't have any objections showing you his license. The fact that he becomes uncomfortable when you talk about his license, that shows you that he is a scammer and there's something is wrong with what he's offering you. And later you find out that he's not a real estate officer, he's just a scam artist, and he doesn't even manage that building. So if he would have signed that contract, the contract would be null and void because he doesn't own the property, and you'd be living illegally in a place that is not even suitable for habitation because the place you're about to rent has safety issues because of bacteria that's growing in the building. So anytime there is a restriction, a toxic restriction I'm talking about, it's toxic because you're not allowed to question it. Anytime there's a taboo, ask yourself what people are hiding. Very important. Now, why is it that mental health and sexuality are both taboo subjects in most parts of the world? It's very simple. The moment you recognize that there's something wrong with sexuality in general, how people are sexually, or you acknowledge that a lot of times people have mental issues, that means you need to look at the context. Think about the example I made earlier in this video about sea life and the quality of water at a zoo. If you have a zoo where they house sea life, then it's their responsibility to make sure the quality of the water is healthy for the sea life. If you find out that some of the sea animals died, then you need to ask, why did they die? Then you look at the context. They are in containers of water. So if they died, they can only die in a container of water because that's where they operate. Then you need to check the container of water. Then you need to check the quality of the water. And if you find out that the quality of the water is bad because it has been neglected, then who neglected it? The people that run the zoo. So then the people that run the zoo have something to explain. That's logical, wouldn't it be? Yet, when it comes to society, we don't want to talk about the quality of the context we operate in. Just think about it. If someone ends up mentally ill, the question will be, how did he or she become mentally ill? Nobody comes out of the womb mentally ill. It's just like nobody comes out of the womb instantly speaking fluent French or fluent British. Nobody comes out of the womb and instantly they are a car mechanic. No. Those are things you become. The native language you speak is something that's conditioned into you by your environment. Your first name is something that's been conditioned into you by your environment. There are very few things you chose for yourself. Most of the things you just get from your environment. Even the way you look comes from your parents and your ancestors. Talk about skin color, the color of your eyes, or the color of your hair. So just think about it. Human beings are social creatures and we crave social connection. When the social context is toxic, how come it's toxic? It's because the people that make up the context are toxic. So if the toxicity of the people cause harm to one of their members, in this case the member becomes mentally ill or mentally defect, then who is responsible? The community is. So if the community acknowledges that it's them that maintains a toxic context, then they also are obliged to comply with a solution. and they will have to put up with what they've caused and with the consequences that come with complying with justice. But are people in general, are people generally speaking willing to do this? No, they are not. They just want relief. They don't want to face themselves. Because just think about it like this. If there's a scam going on, for example, you have this fake taxation officer, or this fake taxation service that goes around taxing people, a tax they're not allowed to take from the population. And let's say the scam cost people their lives, because people were kicked out of their homes by debt collectors for not paying taxes taxes that shouldn't exist. Let's say a police investigation comes and the police finds out that there were many people that were aware that the tax was illegal and it was a scam. The police come to ask the following: why did they allow it to continue? Even to the extent that people lost their lives. So if this comes out, that people lost their lives because others were cowards, that's going to be very awkward, and that's going to have very uncomfortable consequences that people don't want to face in their daily life. So what happens often is that the police, to prevent escalation of conflict, they will cover up the case. They will. Or let me give another example. Let's say that you have a household where the father is alcoholic and he beats the children all the time. And let's say you have the wife who ends up speaking at events talking about what type of brave survivor she is. But then one woman in the audience asks, "Ma'am, you married this Victor 20 years ago, right?" The woman says yes. You knew back then that he had an anger issue, that he wasn't willing to face things. The woman says yes, I noticed it. Then the woman asks, "Why did you stay with him?" You should have known that staying with someone who doesn't want to face things will lead to trouble. And another thing, you keep talking about how you were victimized and how sorry we have to feel for you. But what about your children? You picked that man. Your children didn't pick their parents. So you, as a mother, you had your natural obligation to guard and protect your children against that husband of yours, who was obviously out of line. Why did you keep yourself and your children, who had no other choice in that dangerous situation? And now the audience becomes angry at the woman asking the right questions, and she's kicked out of the meeting. That's how it goes in this world. When you notice that something doesn't add up and you ask constructive questions, they turn on you often. Understand that in this world, you are not allowed to ask the constructive questions that are needed to preserve safety and sanity of the community. Because once you do, you'll notice how narcissistic commoners are. Another example that I'm going to close. Drug addicts, people addicted to heroin or cocaine or whatever substance. Society tends to look down on them. But how did those people end up that way? It's proven that people tend to become addicted to substances when they lack proper social bonds. So if a community casts someone out as an outcast, and they now suffer because of this violence, Who is responsible if they end up as a drug addict? The community is. But now the community gets narcissistic supply by looking down on the individual that's an addict. The moment anyone begins to ask constructive questions about the life of the drug addict, the violence and the cowardice of the community is exposed. So now those people that form the community need to admit that they are addicts too. But they feed off the life of another human being. So they are vampiristic. And that's what it comes down to. Fallen mankind is vampiristic. It's just something we don't want to admit. That's why we have taboos. And this vampiristic defect that we have works out in our sexuality, and it harms both our collective as well as our individual mental health. That's why you're not allowed often to discuss sexuality and mental health. Even when they do discuss sexuality and mental health, it's on the surface level. Seldom will people go to the root. Because once you go to the root, you will face taboos. You will face expectations you're not allowed to question. Because once you question those expectations, you'll see the naked truth that people want to hide. Think about it. When was the last time someone told you that society doesn't want to discuss mental health because they don't want to put up with the guilt of what they cause to their own members? When was the last time someone told you that? They will come up with scientific theories, they will come up with all kinds of stories instead of facing the fact that people don't want to face themselves as a group. They want praise unconditionally. They want unconditional approval, no matter whether they comply with justice or not. Fallen mankind wants amnesty without complying with justice. And that's one thing God will not do. God will not grant any amnesty to anyone, anywhere, if they don't comply with justice. Because without justice, there's no safety. Without safety, there can't be any healing nor sanity. So to have safety, sanity, and prosperity, there needs to be justice. And everyone is obliged to comply with justice. You're not willing to comply with justice, then there is no amnesty for you. That means that you will remain stuck in your self-destruction. And if you go so far that you want to drag others in your self-destruction, repercussions will be enforced on you to preserve the human species. That is how it goes with God. God does not grant amnesty without any compliance with justice on the part of the one receiving amnesty. And that is the attitude believers should have. Someone does not want to comply with justice, then they shouldn't receive any amnesty. The whole subject of amnesty shouldn't even come to mind if there is no justice. So taboos are there to hide injustice people don't want to address. Why do they want to address injustice? Because they benefit from the injustice. That's why there is poverty in the world. Because poverty gives narcissistic relief to the commoners. Because they can compare themselves to people who are worse off than they are, and because of this they feel at ease. The moment they lose this narcissistic supply, they now have to face their own narcissistic tendencies. They will have to face their black and white thinking. And if they come face to face with their own anxieties, most people will just escalate. They wouldn't bear it because they can't bear frustration, and they'll act out. So to keep the population calm, the leaders of the world make sure that there are always ghettos and peripheries around to give narcissistic supply to the masses. Because it's the narcissistic supply that the masses feed on. It's the narcissistic supply that becomes the self-worth that worldly people fight for. The self-worth of worldly people comes from narcissistic supply provided to them by society. But the moment you admit this, all motivation for you to contribute to society disappears. Because now you see that it's a bunch of psychic addicts who demand to be fed at everyone's expense. And now you see that they will also turn on you to vampirize you the moment you don't give in to their expectations they don't want to account for. That's why society needs to convince you with lovely stories for you to comply with it. Because once you see through the scam, you won't be motivated to get along with it anymore. And the more people for fake the scam, the less narcissistic supply there will be for the commoners. And when the commoners don't get the narcissistic supply, when they don't get their high, they escalate. Well, that's it for this video. I hope I've opened your eyes about this subject of taboos, and I related it to mental health and to sexuality. Realize that commoners depend on the self-worth that society provides them with. And this self-worth is fear-based, and it only works in comparison to someone who's worse off. So the world runs on a narcissistic supply. It's just that people don't want to admit this. Because to admit this would also mean they need to admit that they are the ones keeping the danger in existence. And that means that once they admit that, then they need to look for help. And the only solution is Christ. They don't want to go there. They want to play God because they're proud. That's the whole issue. Well, that's it for now. Keep agreeing with Christ and be at peace.